This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Derrell Peel, Oklahoma State University livestock economist, begins today's show with the cattle market update. He explains what he saw in the first half of the year for the cattle market and what he expects for the second half. The show continues with K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz as he explains important nutrients for corn and soybeans and what growers should think through if their field appears deficient. A segment of Faces in Agriculture with George Hunsinger from Douglas County concludes the show with information about his operation and how it has evolved. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you this morning.
Derrell, as we've officially entered the second half of the year for 2025, is there anything notable from the first half of the year for our cattle producers?
Well, I think anybody looking at cattle markets in the first half of the year would just have to be pretty amazed at the run we've had, after climbing for the last couple of years. Feeder and fed cattle, feeder cattle prices were up about 18% through the course of the first half of the year. Fed cattle prices were more like 20%. And, box beef values went up even more than that from the early year low. So it was a phenomenal first half of the year, I think, from that standpoint. And, we did see some changes in the first half of the year in terms of beef production. We started the year, the first quarter of the year, beef production was very similar to last year, with fed beef production staying pretty steady on a year-over-year basis. We just hadn't seen the drop last year that we expected to see. But in the second quarter, that began to change. And so fed slaughter and fed beef production began to drop. Of course, non-fed beef, the cull cow stuff, has been down for the last 2 years, continues to be down. So all of that added up to, a notable decrease in beef production in the second quarter of the year. And that's part of what set up such strong beef markets as we ended the first half of the year.
So with your crystal ball that I know every livestock economist has, what are you thinking for the second half of the year?
Well, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind as we go forward. One is I don't think I would expect to see the same kind of run in cattle prices in the second half of the year that we had in the first half of the year. We did see kind of a slowdown in mid to late June a bit in cattle markets. Both feeder and fed cattle markets showed a little bit of pullback, and that's not too surprising at all. I don't think it's a major change in the sea winds here. I think the cattle markets will, fed cattle markets may move kind of sideways here through the heat of the summer. Feeder cattle markets, it's hard to say. They could back off a little bit, although, their seasonal trend is higher. So, I suspect that they will continue to be, more sideways. What I think we're looking at here is a slower rate of increase in cattle prices in the second half of the year, more than likely, at least given where we are at the moment. Now, the other thing, of course, is we still don't really know where we're at with any heifer retention or herd rebuilding. So that could change things a little bit as we go forward. But, the market still looks strong. I think probably just at a somewhat slower pace here in the second half of the year. I do think beef production will continue to fall in the second half of the year.
And what factors are you still seeing when you talk or think about cattle producers wanting to keep back more heifers?
Yeah, we keep getting indications sort of anecdotally from producers, from lenders, that they're getting a lot of inquiries about that. We do know that, pasture and range conditions and forage production generally has improved significantly in the southern half of the country, basically. The northern plains, some parts of it have been seeing some additional drought relief, but there are some other areas that are still pretty severe. So, that'll be a bit of a limiting factor. But all in all, I think it's happening. We don't really have the data to confirm it yet. And I think it's happening probably at a relatively slow pace. We're hoping that by late July, we're going to get a cattle on feed report, which will have a July breakdown of steers and heifers on feed. And we'll be watching that carefully to see if the heifers on feed continues to fall as it did in the April report. And then the July mid-year cattle inventory report will give us some numbers on cattle inventories, including beef replacement heifers in the middle of the year. The problem is going to be, it's going to be a little hard to interpret because we don't have last year's report to compare to. So we're not going to know precisely what it means, but it will give us some indications. We'll be looking for that data pretty carefully.
And besides us usually talking about herd rebuilding, something we've been keeping up to date on, the Mexico border with New World screwworm, and where are we at?
Yeah, so, the border's been completely closed since early May as USDA is trying to get in sync with the Mexican authorities on controlling or at least containing and then beginning to control screwworm that had gotten into kind of the main body of Mexico. U.S. and Mexican authorities have worked hard the last few weeks to improve the process of trying to contain and control screwworm to keep it from encroaching even closer to the U.S. border. And satisfied with that progress, USDA has announced that they will begin a phased reopening of the border ports. Now, they're going to start on the western side of Mexico with the port in Arizona, Douglas, and then move eastward there through the New Mexico ports and eventually to the Texas ports. And that makes sense. The greatest threat is in the Texas ports to South Texas. If you think about the way Texas dips down to the southern tip, that gets farther and closer to the area where the threat would be. So we're going to begin a phased reopening. I think the dates they've published are right after July 4th for Douglas, Arizona, and then from there on, Columbus, New Mexico, Santa Teresa, New Mexico. And, the Douglas port doesn't cross that many beef cattle. And they said it would be limited only to Chihuahua and Sonora cattle. But I wouldn't expect very many Chihuahua cattle. Chihuahua is a big beef cattle state for exportation. But, that's going way west. That's kind of going away from where their markets are. So I really don't expect to see a lot of cattle. And I think that's intentional on the part of USDA to kind of start with the low volume ports. And there'll be some backlogs or there'll be some bottlenecks at the border with this process. Once you get into the New Mexico ports at Columbus and especially Santa Teresa, that's the biggest port on the border, we'll get into more potential for cattle to come up. But even there, I think the process will be fairly slow. There will continue to be undoubtedly some bottlenecks with just the physical process of getting cattle across the border. So all of that to say that we are going to begin some phased reopening, but the volume of cattle coming in from Mexico will be quite slow for certainly several more weeks to a few months. And maybe by the end of the year, we're getting back close to normal. But all of that to say that it's going to continue to restrict the number of cattle coming in as we go forward. It's a process. It takes time. It's a very complicated process, and it's a very long border. So there's a lot of things that have to take place to take care of all of that.
Are the cattle we're going to be seeing coming from Mexico still those spayed heifers?
So everything coming across as feeder cattle are non-breeding animals, so they have to be either castrated males or spayed heifers. And that may be one of the things. Again, there's undoubtedly a backlog now of cattle that we're going to cross that now have not been able to for the last few weeks. And so if any of those are spayed heifers that are up against their 6-month clock on when they have to get across, those will probably be the first ones that go. And we may see more of those try to go to those western ports, even though it's a little out of the way for them. But if they're up against their timeline, we may see some of those heifers move over towards those western ports to try to get them across before the clock expires on them.
And Derrell, even though we are now past the 4th of July, what do we see for beef and hamburger prices, and what can we expect for the future?
I mentioned earlier that the second quarter we saw both fed beef production drop, which we hadn't seen before, as well as continued declines in non-fed beef. And so, if you look at the ground beef market first, 90% trimmings are at record high levels. And what we saw in the second quarter was a sharp increase in the 50% lean trimmings, which comes from fed cattle. And so when you put those together into, whatever combination of ground beef you might want, if you do a 5-to-1, 90 to 50% trimmings ratio, that gives you about an 83% lean combination. Or if you do a 7-to-1, 90s to 50s, that gives you an 85% lean ratio. But the bottom line is with both of those trimmings, both the 90s and the 50s jumping up, those prices are at record levels for that combo, if you think of that as kind of a standard combination for ground beef. The 50% trimmings price jumped sharply. It's exceeded in history only by 2 weeks during the worst of the packing plant close downs in May of 2020. But other than that, it's a record high 50s price. The 90s have been at a record high price for some time here. So the ground beef market's just been very high. And if you look at the broader cutout value, of course, it jumped. It really increased steadily through the last few weeks of the second quarter. And if you look at the individual cuts, pretty much across the board, with very few exceptions, almost all of the wholesale cuts, whether it's end meats or middle meats, almost all of them strengthened, again, partly on that supply pressure from reduced fed beef production. So I think as long as we go forward here, we don't see any indication of real consumer demand weakness at all. So we're likely to continue to see these higher prices, continue and probably build a little more as supply continues to tighten.
Derrell, you recently wrote about these topics in your Cow-Calf Corner newsletter. So if people would like to read those or subscribe to that newsletter, how can they do that?
There's a couple ways to do it, but probably the easiest one is just to send me an email at derrell.peel@okstate.edu and just tell me you'd like to get on the newsletter list. We continue to write the weekly Cow-Calf Corner newsletter along with Paul Beck and Mark Johnson over in Animal Science at OSU. And we'd be delighted to put you on the email list to receive that newsletter every week.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. His email, if you would like to get subscribed to the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, is derrell.peel@okstate.edu. That is DERRELL.PEEL@okstate.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about nutrients in corn and soybeans with K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, what are these different nutrients that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about corn and soybeans?
Yes, these are obviously both crops are growing very actively right now, and it's the time of the year that you may start to see some deficiencies, some yellowing showing up in some fields, and it's a good time to identify some of those issues. In some cases, maybe we are able to do some corrective actions. In some cases, it's something we need to consider for fixing it for the next year, for next crop. And so definitely, again, as we have very active growing crops, now is the time to start paying attention to those issues that may be showing up in some fields.
What are those specific nutrients that we want to keep in mind for both crops?
Yes, so we really should be looking at all the main nutrients, obviously, and the key is really how to identify them and maybe find a little bit of a system here to identify which ones are the potential nutrients, maybe do some follow-up, and like I say, maybe some potential corrective actions if possible. One easy way to look at, as we're looking at some of these deficiencies showing up in the fields, one general rule is to look at the mobility of these nutrients within the plant, and that basically will determine whether or not that deficiency is showing up in the upper part of the plant, in the younger leaves, or if it's showing up in the older leaves, in the lower part of the canopy. And if we're talking about mobile nutrients, these are mobile nutrients within the plant. Okay, so just emphasize that we're talking within the plant. Mobile nutrients usually tends to show up deficiencies in the lower leaves, and that's, for example, nitrogen. If you think about nitrogen, usually the firing, the yellowing, so it's going to be in the lower part of the leaves because, again, that nutrient is mobile and the plant is moving that nutrient, that nitrogen, to the growing parts in the younger part of the growing tissues. And so, again, that's one key aspect to look at. Other nutrients that will tend to show up in the lower part of the canopy is going to be phosphorus, also a mobile nutrient within the plant. And then, of course, potassium. And if you think about potassium, oftentimes very similar to nitrogen in the way kind of that deficiencies show up, but there are some key differences there. And then magnesium is one that we don't talk too much about, and it's very, very unusual to see that in Kansas, but sometimes in some specific parts of the field that may be something that show up. So anyways, we talk about some of the key mobile nutrients here: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. So basically, again, your NP and K main nutrients are going to be all mobile nutrients, and deficiencies are going to be showing up first in the lower part of the canopy. Either we're talking soybeans or corn, those deficiencies will be quite similar, right? Especially for things like nitrogen, it's a lot more common to see it obviously in corn. In the case of soybeans, we know that soybeans should be fixing nitrogen. But if we do start to see some potential nitrogen deficiencies in soybean, this is the time where we can go and check what happened to nodulation. Do we have active nodules fixing nitrogen? And so we need to pay close attention to that. And this may be an indication whether or not we're doing a good job with inoculating the soybean crops and whether or not we need to make some adjustments or emphasizing that in the future. In the case of corn, similar things. We're putting enough nitrogen. Do we have any potential losses happening of nitrogen that resulting in nitrogen deficiency? So again, once we know where are these potential deficiencies showing up, the key is identifying the reasons why we're seeing these and whether or not we can make some changes.
Are there specific nutrients for each crop that producers maybe should keep a closer eye on?
Yes, from this group of NP and K and magnesium, in the case of, again, mobile nutrients in the plant, for sure, again, nitrogen is a big one for corn. And for soybean, is really typically will tend to be more phosphorus and potassium. Soybean is a big user of potassium in particular, so it's not uncommon that we start to see some potassium deficiency show up in soybean more commonly. And so again, those are going to be the ones I'll definitely pay close attention to. One thing I mentioned earlier a little bit is try to identify the roots of these deficiency symptoms. And obviously, one of the key reasons is going to be low nutrient levels in the soil, right? So low nutrients in that particular soil. But in some cases, we may also see other issues creating these deficiency problems. For example, compaction affecting root development, and that's very common in the case of potassium. And again, we can see quite a bit of potassium deficiency in corn and soybeans. Even when soil tests are optimum, and oftentimes that's because we have some compaction issues. Poor root development, we do have some parts of the state that have significant amount of rain in recent weeks, and root development maybe is affected in those cases. And again, access to nutrients will be affected. So root development in that case, compaction, other issues in the case of nitrogen in soybeans like poor inoculation and obviously poor nodulation, and that's another factor. Things like very high pH or very low pH acidic soils can also be affecting nutrient availability. And again, those are things that we need to be looking at. In some cases, it's really just perhaps also some damage to the root system due to insects or some sort of injury. So again, we want to follow up, also identify what is the cause of that deficiency.
Is this usually widespread across the field or just certain areas?
For these particular nutrients will tend to be more general, entire fields for the most part, because again, we're talking about these macronutrients, NP and K. Now, this is a good point about the next group of nutrients, which is typically more of the micronutrients, and these are usually nutrients that are immobile within the plant. Okay, and so these are the ones that will tend to show up deficiency in the younger leaves, in the new leaves. That's where we usually tend to see that yellowing happen. And in this group, it's going to be most of your micronutrients. You know, we're talking about iron, boron, copper, zinc. Also, the secondary nutrient, sulfur, is actually in this category as well. So if you think about yellowing happening in the younger leaves, that kind of looks like nitrogen, but it's really showing up in the younger leaves, that more likely is going to be sulfur. And sulfur is one that is becoming pretty common to see in the state as well. We do see it primarily in corn. Not as much in soybean yet. We know that it's soybean sulfur deficiency in soybean is happening in other parts of the country, and so it is possible that we'll start to see some as well here, but it's definitely a crop that uses quite a bit of sulfur, but we just haven't seen a lot of deficiency symptoms like we do in corn and other crops as well. So anyways, in this group of nutrients, immobile nutrients are going to be all the micros. And this is basically to your question. This type of deficiency usually tends to be more specific parts of the field. Even in the case of sulfur, it's very rarely it's going to be the entire field that shows deficiency, but often tends to follow specific areas of the field that maybe are lower in organic matter. Maybe we have some erosion happening. And again, maybe we have also some issues of pH in the case of iron, for example, where we have maybe some leveling that happened in that field in the past, and we have some specific parts that are going to be pretty high in pH that generate some of that deficiency symptoms. And so that's another key characteristics, obviously, where in that plant is that deficiency is happening, and also, as you mentioned, the distribution of those deficiency plants in the field. Again, those micronutrients will tend to be more spotty, basically, across the field.
Can producers test for this?
Yes, that's an excellent point, and that would be obviously the next step. First is we want to identify what's happening in the field, but then obviously to confirm this, we want to do some tissue analysis, and that's usually will be the way to confirm this. We do have many guidelines out there to look at identifying deficiency symptoms visually, but ultimately tissue testing is the way to confirm whether we are seeing these problems. And even though in some of these cases we may not able to do much this growing season, I think this is still very important information to have, to know what kind of issues we have now, because this is the time of the year where you are able to see this. And of course, if we identify this now, we can think about it for next season, for the next crop.
If people have questions about this, about nutrients in their crops, or about how to get them tested, what's your recommendation?
I definitely encourage people to look at some of the guidelines for deficiency symptoms, but also follow up with soil testing labs and again submit those samples. What plant parts maybe need to be submitted, which is another key consideration. In this particular case, we're really talking about diagnostic. We're trying to find out what the problem is, and so trying to identify what plant part, and especially those plant parts that are showing symptoms, are going to be the way to go. We really want to just, again, verify what is the problem in this case.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. If you'd like to read more on this topic, I will link to Agronomy E-Update articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net. The first article is from June 20th, and the second article is from June 26th. We're now cutting to that short break on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with another segment of Faces in Agriculture. And this month, we're joined by someone involved in agriculture from Douglas County, George Hunsinger. George, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
George, can you tell us a little bit about your operation?
I'm a third-generation farmer. We're 4 miles south of the city limits of Lawrence in Douglas County. My grandfather established this in 1919. My uncle was a full-time farmer. Me and my dad, we farmed on the side. We both had jobs back in the day. And then I took over the farm completely after my dad and my uncle passed away. And I retired about 4 years ago from a full-time job, but I'm still farming. We pretty much, like everybody in this part of Kansas, it's a corn and soybean rotation. And we're small potatoes anymore. The city's getting closer and closer, and we're just a little over 100 acres of row crop. But we run quite a few beef cattle. Those are the three things in this part of Kansas that's pretty strong, and so we run a lot of beef cattle and make a little bit of hay, take care of that. Probably 10 or 12 years ago, I'd have to go back and look, started something that just I thought it was a cool idea and to play around with it. We started planting about anywhere from 5 to 7 acres of sunflowers every year. We plant the black oil seed kind, like it's in bird seed or like they crush for sunflower oil. And our big thing was after they come up, when they bloom, we open it up to the public. We do not charge. There's some props out there in the field. We do have a donation box, and it's been quite a hit because everybody likes their pictures in the sunflowers. We've had weddings. We've had lots of senior pictures. So that's been kind of a win-win. And then we do harvest them, and I take them to my local elevator, and he bags them for me, and I sell them locally just through word of mouth or Facebook or whatever. Black oil birdseed, that's exactly what it is, and that's went over pretty well for us.
George, what have been some challenges you've had?
Oh, about it. Well, like every other farmer has challenges. Mother Nature a lot of times is not on our side, nor is the markets, nor is the banker. I mean, there's just all kinds of challenges in agriculture. You may be having a good day and you have a bad breakdown in your machinery. You just never know what each day brings ahead. You just kind of forge on. I've always said that a farmer is the most optimistic person in the world.
What have been some things that you found really important to being successful and having your operation?
Oh, just good management. You got to understand, my dad and my uncle, they were born in the 20s and 30s, so they farmed kind of old school. And through trial and error, things like that, we've made lots of changes around here. We try to run really good herd health in our cattle herd. I'm sure that what I'm doing, is far and above what my family did back in the day. Challenges, you just got to be a good business manager with interest rates and the value of the dollar in the markets. You just have to be a good business manager, kind of plan ahead and try to don't do things the cheap way, but do them the most efficient way.
What are you looking forward to in agriculture?
Oh, my. Just the next generation. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. We have 3 daughters. They all live in the rural part, but they all have jobs, and not really. My youngest does kind of like agriculture, so I guess what I'm looking forward to is maybe some of my grandsons, when they get old enough, will start working with me, and they can take over sometime.
As you have seen generations change on the farm, what's your piece of advice to others?
Oh, my. Again, good management. I'm a believer that good management practices, just, on those cold, snowy days when you can't do a lot, just get at your desk, get at your computer, whatever, and look for ways to improve your management side of it, how your expenses, your income, and just concentrate hard, and I think you'll be okay.
George, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
No problem.
That was George Hunsinger, who's involved in agriculture in Douglas County. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.